Good afternoon to all of you, to all my friends from media, print media, electronic media. On behalf of the 15th Finance Commission and on my own behalf, I welcome you to this traditional interactive session with the Commission. We begin by expressing our gratitude to the state government for all the arrangements and for their very generous hospitality and drawing up a program which has enabled the Commission to have an interaction with all stakeholders. During our stay in Odisha, we have had interactions with all important stakeholders. This includes the panchayats, the district parishads, the urban local bodies, with an exceedingly fruitful and interactive session with representatives of all political parties, which we had yesterday. I must say it was quite lively too, and quite candid, with representatives of trade and industry, in which also this entire issue of what can be done to enhance private investment in the state of Odisha, which has been endowed with such terrific mineral resources, and how to really take Odisha in the direction of making this also a manufacturing hub, which will create jobs and which will enable Odisha to really maximize on its important factor endowments, principally its rich mineral potential. Thereafter, we had interactions today fully with the Honorable Chief Minister, with the Finance Minister and other senior colleagues, with representatives of the state government, and that was very enriching to the Commission too. So what's the take back which the Commission really is going to consider in the coming months? Also, I think by way of background, let me just say that Odisha is, correct me Arvind, it is the 15th? 16th. Odisha is the 16th state that the Commission has so far visited. We have still a long way to go. We will be obliged to submit our report towards the end of this year for enabling this to be fully factored in the budget of 20, and really thereafter for these recommendations to be implemented over the next 5 fiscal years from 20 to 25. So I think in that context, our work is more than halfway through, and I think some of the problems of Odisha are not dramatically different than the problems of some of the other states which do not form part of the very large developed states really we have encountered. So the 4 or 5 big takes which I have as far as Odisha is concerned, and then I'm willing to answer some questions on the general overall Indian overall scenario as far as the Commission is concerned. But first let me deal very briefly with Odisha. First, I think Odisha has had the benefit of continued political stability with an enlightened political leadership, where the leadership is quite aligned to improving the growth potential of this state. Very significant progress has been made in reducing poverty, although poverty numbers still continue to be significantly higher than the average all India poverty numbers. In terms of per capita income too, there has been a significant improvement in the per capita income, but still it has a long way to go before it catches up to the national average per capita income. In terms of the social indicators of progress, in spite of the very significant improvement in many health indices, there are some health indices where more progress is required. Strengthening, of course, in terms of the total number of medical colleges, improving the average availability of doctors per segment of population. Right now, the availability of one doctor for 8 to 10,000 people is not the kind of picture which would be really, which is a welcome picture. So increasing the number of functioning medical institutes, changing and fine-tuning the regulatory structures which will enable more doctors, paramedics along with doctors, making primary health centers more accountable, a system of compulsory auditing and reporting to improve the working of primary health centers, and of course for higher levels of medical education and the number of medical colleges to be significantly improved. This is an area on which there was a convergence of view between the state government and the Commission. Similarly, in respect of the in respect of the indices on education, whereas in terms of access and so on, remarkable progress has been made in terms of improving the overall literacy ratio. Nonetheless, in improving the outcomes particularly at higher secondary and upper primary and other higher education, a lot more needs to be done if one were to really look to the last ACER report on the annual status of education, which is published by the NGO. So recognize that in terms of the social indices, notwithstanding great progress, much more needs to be done. In terms of growth rates, Odisha has achieved for several years growth rates significantly higher than the national averages of 10% plus, but it has exhibited significant volatility and a lack of consistency in very long term in growth trends, with some 1 or 2 years the growth dipping well below acceptable levels. It could be on account of the natural calamity and natural disasters, and this could be one particular mitigating factor. But maintaining high trend rates of economic growth, which translates itself on a sustained increase in per capita income and therefore in terms of poverty numbers, is an area where they will focus further. In the area of agriculture, an enormous amount of effort is going in to improving the reach of irrigated area, lift irrigation, and other innovative agricultural practices. But nonetheless, the Commission brought out that much more needs to be done by way of crop diversification and in terms of improving yields on rice and other crops which are currently being grown. And since the contribution of the primary sector continues to be large, this is an area where I think we would be happier to see much greater and more significant progress. On the overall story of the factor endowments, we all know that Odisha has over 72% of India's mineral resources, but the contribution of the manufacturing sector in relation to its mineral resources continues to be rather modest, and the primary sector is still important, and the tertiary sector is really to really take off. There have been much greater improvements in the services sector. On overall financial management and metrics, it has to be given to the credit of the state government, and they have done a commendable exercise in improving their financial parameters significantly in the recent years. The overall debt to GDP numbers are more or less in the area of what the FRBM Act would like the debt to GDP numbers to be. We would like in the FRBM Act for the debt to be GDP to be around in the figure of around 20% or so. And Odisha's debt to GDP numbers are in the figure of, in the region of 20% or so. No doubt, in the last 2 years, there has been a significant augmentation in the overall stock of debt, which was explained on account of some important initiatives which have been taken. On fiscal deficit numbers, too, they have been within the, most years in the recent years, they have been within the range of around 3% or so, but the BE for the projected overshoots the 3%. We have, however, been assured that we will keep the fiscal deficit numbers and the debt numbers within the principal parameters defined under the revised FRBM Act, and this therefore represents an important progress on conformity to overall macroeconomic stability as far as Odisha's financial management is concerned. So I think that all in all, I think that disaster continues to be a very, very important challenge for the state. The consequences of disaster was brought out dramatically in a short film that was shown to the Commission. We recognize that Odisha has done a commendable job and has earned global praise for the speed and alacrity with which in some recent disasters Odisha managed the overall disaster management, minimizing its adverse impact on infrastructure and on human lives. But I think that they are key to further augment their capability on disaster management. Some specific proposals have been for the Finance Commission on strengthening the disaster mitigation strategy, disaster prevention strategy, and disaster management in general, including on the amounts of resources made available for State Disaster Management Fund and as part of what can come from other resources of the central government. We will look at these proposals in a constructive spirit, and it will be the Commission's endeavour that looking at the impact of disaster on the economy of Odisha, what we can do to further strengthen Odisha's capability in respect of preventing the consequences of handling disaster, preventing, and in terms of mitigation measures. So these are some of the broad conclusions. In short, I will say Odisha is on a high growth trajectory, given its enlightened political stability and leadership, and it will be the Commission's endeavour to try and strengthen Odisha's efforts for long-term sustained high rates of economic growth and a well-balanced economic growth which enables Odisha's comparative factor advantages to be fully realized in terms of downstream manufacturing activity and job-creating capabilities. In this, the augmentation of the agricultural sector will have a very important role to play. I'll stop here, and I'm going to request if my colleagues would like to add anything. Would you want to say anything?
I only want to say that whenever I come to Odisha, I remind myself that I'm in the land of Lord Jagannath, the old Kalinga kingdom, and a very important historic place. And what is, I'm sure I speak on my behalf and my colleagues' behalf, what is very touching is the convergence. You know, everyone talks about that the poorer countries should grow faster than the richer countries and they should come together. Odisha has been growing faster than the rest of India. And the other thing, as the chairman said, the Finance Commission's job is to distribute funds. If you give more to one, you will be giving less to other. So we keep a close watch on how the money is being utilized. And there seems to be indications that the utilization of funds and the effectiveness of public expenditure has improved in Odisha. And that's a very encouraging sign.
Okay, thank you, Ashu. And Dr. Anup Singh?
I just make one point. We were very pleased to also learn that the state government is taking many steps to ensure that their accounting and reporting procedures meet international best standards, and they have more initiatives in this regard.
Member Dr. Ramesh Chand.
I would like to share with you an incident which will tell you how much change in Odisha has happened. I came first time to Odisha in 1984 with my son who was 1 year old. We meet here in the evening and we had to do something to my son, and we went to many hotels and shops. We could not get milk in Bhubaneswar in 1984. That was the situation. And you look at the situation today, the contrast. Today, if you look at Odisha's contribution in the central procurement of rice, Punjab comes at the top with 11 million tons. Then there are 4 states which contribute 3 to 4 million tons. They are Andhra, Chhattisgarh, Haryana, and Odisha has also contributed. So big changes are happening in Odisha, but there is a lot of tension. Still productivity is low, so we discussed with the state leadership and ministers also gave our suggestions that how state need to move at a faster rate for agricultural insurance because it is a disaster-prone state, how they should strengthen their cooperatives because still the reach of commercial bank is not there up to village level, and how they should go for diversification and agro-processing. That's all.
Thank you. Secretary Shri Arvind Mehta.
Thank you, sir. I think it's been covered. Overall, it's been a very optimistic scenario that we have seen. Dr. Lahiri has hinted at that. And the poverty levels have come down. And I think it is our hope that during the tenure of this commission of 2025 and 2020 to 2025, if it's going on the same trend as it has been going, we expect to see that extreme poverty will probably no longer be an issue in Odisha. That would speak highly about its developmental path. And in today's discussion, one of the other direct impacts that have been seen is the implementation, which is going to start of the Kalia scheme. It's something that the Commission and many others are keenly watching to see how this experiment turns out in terms of both fiscal sustainability as well as impact. So overall, the assessment is positive.
Well, I'm glad that I should have. Thank you, Arvind, for reminding me. I think there's general unanimity that the Kalia scheme, which has been, on which the Odisha government have taken a lead, is in some ways the best which has been conceived so far. There is all-round commendation on the Kalia scheme, and it is the earnest hope and expectation that the implementation of this and the identification of the beneficiaries would be completed in a manner which meets the benchmark of credibility and transparency, so that the benefits of the Kalia scheme can be translated to those for whom it is intended with the same rapidity with which the scheme has been conceived. Now, I'm willing to take, my colleagues and I are willing to take a few very pointed questions. Who would like to begin, if any? You just identify yourself. Okay.
So, Odisha was demanding special category status for last several years. Now they have left these things and they are demanding special package. So, will you recommend for special package?
So, the issue of special category status is an issue that I have addressed earlier in several other states which have also been demanding or had been demanding a special category status, particularly Andhra Pradesh and Bihar. Now, the issue of special category status is not within the purview and the terms of reference of the Finance Commission. We would be therefore transgressing our mandate if we began to directly enter into the question of the rationale or otherwise of special category status. The only thing which the last Finance Commission did was that it said that they did not think it was appropriate to classify states into different categories, but it was their intention to examine the fiscal scenario of each individual state instead of by grouping the states in one category or the other. That's the only thing that the 14th Finance Commission did. This is not an issue within the purview of the Finance Commission, and therefore we would not like to comment one way or the other about the special category status, since we do not want to comment on an issue which is not within the purview of our terms of reference. Now, on a special package which Odisha would like to seek. They have presented this in the memorandum. They would like to have a 90-10 in terms of the centrally sponsored schemes. This demand has been factored in the detailed memorandum which they have submitted to the Commission, including the projections of the revenue deficit in the pre-devolution pre-devolution status. We will examine this in the same way as we will examine many other suggestions contained in this memorandum.
Sir, this is Dr. Sahu from Asian. Sir, the Chief Minister in his speech made here has demanded increase in devolution of taxes from 42% to 7%. But how do you react to it?
Well, that's a core item on the Commission's recommendation of what would be an appropriate vertical division between the central government and the state governments. And we are listening to different points of view, but we have not made up our mind on what would be appropriate. The Commission is still awaiting the detailed submissions of the central government, and we hope to get those detailed submissions in the course of the next 1 month in the preliminary draft, and subsequently in terms of the financial projections, which will enable us to assess how much resources does the Commission have before we go into the distribution of this. But the issue of vertical distribution on which the Commission has to take a view is an issue which is an ongoing exercise, and we have not firmly made up our mind one way or the other.
Sir, this is from Telegraph newspaper. Sir, the last few days, Odisha is setting the demand for fiscal autonomy because it is alleging that it is being neglected of central authority for the state finance sector, so it is demanding fiscal autonomy for the state so that it is no more required special state patronage spending. So how is the response to it?
Well, you know, the term fiscal autonomy can lend itself to multiple interpretations. Fiscal autonomy is guaranteed in the Constitution itself. Now, if by fiscal autonomy is meant that subjects which are in the purview of the states, the central government should not dabble in those subjects, that relates to the future of the 7th schedule of the Constitution. But the fact remains that all centrally sponsored schemes in one form or the other currently are part of the subjects assigned to the states. On many of these, there have been independent standalone legislations which have not happened recently, but which have been there for quite some time, like the right to food, the right to employment, the right to education. These have independent legislations of Parliament on which these rights have been guaranteed. Although technically, if you look really earlier, they form part of the subjects assigned to states like employment and food and so on and so forth. So that's one area in which the future of centrally sponsored schemes, if that is the issue, that's an area on which the Commission itself is engaged on whether or not and in what manner the centrally sponsored schemes should continue. By the way, you know, the centrally sponsored schemes which began a long time ago, which began as early as the Planning Commission. It's not something which has happened yesterday or day before yesterday. Now, they used to be earlier coterminous with the life cycle of the 5-year plans. Now, the 5-year plans have really now disappeared. So, they have, by an order of the Department of Expenditure in the Ministry of Finance, now been made coterminous with the life cycle of every finance commission. And therefore, we will be having a close look at the centrally sponsored schemes, the rationale and so on, and we expect that when the central government submits its submissions on memorandum, this issue would have been addressed with them. Now, fiscal autonomy also implies unconditional transfer of resources. Now, that part of the transfer of resources, which form part of the horizontal criteria or the horizontal, are transferred without conditions, and that is indeed automatic. But those transfers which are state-specific requests, And the government of Odisha, like other states, has made number of state-specific requests. By their very logic, subject themselves to the kind of framework which would be acceptable in terms of the demand, and those we will have to really consider more carefully on whether such state-specific grants should be considered or not. And finally, on revenue deficit grants, which is one area under Article 275, we will have to consider the fiscal situation, the projected expenditure, the projected revenue, to come to the conclusion on whether and to what extent the revenue deficit grants would be admissible. Two more questions.
So I would like to know the criteria for grant contribution by CMC is on the basis of population control. So do you think the states who have done commendable job for population control like Odisha will hamper on this, sir?
Let me put it this way to you, that in the terms of reference of the Finance Commission, it has been stipulated that if we use population, then we should really, as a criteria for the horizontal distribution, the Commission has been asked to use 2011 census figures. Now, I've explained, my colleagues and I have explained several times, that we don't frame the terms of reference. We are the recipients, the Commission is a recipient and not the framer of the terms of reference. If you want to alter the terms of reference, the only person competent to do so is the President of India, who has set up the Commission and given these terms of reference. Now, having said this, let me also say that if you read the terms of reference, it also says to consider measures for incentivizing states which have achieved demographic replacement and which have achieved success on population management. It is therefore for the Commission to interpret those terms of reference within the framework of what has been given to us in a manner where there is no penalty for performance, efficiency not discarded, consistent with the principles of equity and integrity of the terms of Commission. It is a challenge for the Commission to find a balance which would enable the virtues of efficiency and equity to be maximized. The PTI had asked the question first. So. I didn't. The 14th Finance Commission did. I don't know about that, because I do not want to enter into the merits of the recommendations of a previous Finance Commission. It is not appropriate either. We are responsible for the recommendations that we will make. The issue of whether or not the full benefits of an enhancement from 32 to 42 has been raised by many states, and they are alluding to the fact that the share in the centrally sponsored schemes came down. The share of the central government in the funding of those came down, plus some other kinds of devolutions which took place also came down, and therefore they did not really get the full benefit of this extra 10%, which is what you are saying. But I think you must counterbalance with the fact that the money which the central government is spending on centrally sponsored schemes is really over and above the 42. The money which the central government is providing through the Finance Commission for the third tier, for Panchayat Raj institutions, for urban local bodies, is also really in addition to that. So one has to really take a very balanced view. As I said earlier, that the demand of enhancing it further from 42 to 50, many states have made. The Commission will have to take the submissions of the central government into account, their inescapable liabilities, capacity of the states, and come to an appropriate conclusion. Two more questions, one Samvad. This is not for us to either recommend or condemn. Centrally sponsored schemes are not schemes which were either initiated by us, and we will review it on those, we will review it in a generic way. after we receive the recommendations, after we receive the recommendation advice of the principles on which the central government will submit its memorandum and submissions to the Commission, we are not going into the micro details of each of those centrally sponsored schemes, but will view them as a generic category.
Sir, what is the total demand Odisha raised before you for the state of Odisha during the previous management?
They have raised demands in various categories. It's a decision of the Odisha government on whether they would like to make their memorandum a public document or not. In the absence of any such thing, it will not be appropriate for me to disclose really what is really correspondence between the government of Odisha and the Finance Commission. But yes, they have raised a large demand onto various heads on what they believe should be the devolution which they expect to meet their projected expenditure and revenue. They have raised demands on what they believe are the likely revenue deficit grants. They have made number of suggestions in regard to disaster and disaster management. They have made number of demands on some state-specific projects, all of which is in their memorandum, and it will be for the government of Odisha to decide entirely within its own autonomy on whether or not they would like to make their memorandum of the Finance Commission a public document or not.
Sir, I want to know, there are some specific areas in Odisha, for example, your KBC system, for example, your Naxal areas like Chitrakoota or those are part of areas. What is happening when you are sending money, when the money is coming, it is coming for the whole. But those areas which are going deep to deep in poverty, whether the Commission has any interest to look after this.
I thought that one of your colleagues had just raised the question of guaranteeing the autonomy of the states. Now you want the Commission to do the very opposite, not give a generic, untied thing, but look into the specific difficulties of different areas and different categories. No, I think that the problems relating to either the KBK district or those which are affected by Naxal violence is something for the state government to appropriately deal with. We cannot go into details of that kind, but we will, those which form part of the state-specific requests, we will go into the merits or otherwise of those. तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट जाने ऐसा है कि वित्त आयोग को केंद्र मंत्रालय का हम लोग आर्म नहीं है. It's a misnomer to believe that the Finance Commission is an arm of the central government. For us, the central government is equidistant from the state. We are the arbiters of the revenue between the center and the states. We are not neither a spokesman nor an arm of the central government. What they did and what they did not do is something for which the Odisha government should hold the central government responsible.
Now, trends increasing in the country. Most of the states are declaring farm loan wedding. So it will pressure on the fiscal deficit in future. So Odisha government has already denied this. What is your view on this?
So I have said so in an earlier context that it is entirely for each state government to consider what fiscal space is available to them within the overall parameters of macro stability, debt and fiscal deficit for undertaking measures of this kind. And it is entirely for them to therefore consider whether they have the space for a farm loan waiver, a variation of that, or measures designed to ameliorate the distress of the agriculture or the farmer community. I do not want to go into the merits of that. As far as the Odisha government is concerned, they haven't undertaken the farm loan waiver, but they have instead done the Kalia scheme, on which I have commented earlier, that we believe, as a lot of people have written about it, that this is a much better scheme to address the problems of small and marginal farmers who are really, the burden of the debt falls on them more steeply than a loan waiver where the advantages are really to the better off agriculturists. This is no comment on the merits of it, but overall I do believe that the issue of farm loan waivers is an issue which needs to be addressed in the context of ensuring that India's long fought battle on macroeconomic stability is not undercut, because this is one of the strong achievements in the last 5 years, in which both the states and the centers have an equal partner in ensuring that the country's overall macroeconomic situation remains strong for enabling the country to go faster.
Sir, Manish from Odisha Post newspaper. So when the GST was rolled out, different states had apprehensions about the impact of the tax in states, including Odisha. So even Chief Minister, I think, reportedly have asked you for compensation, extension compensation for 10 years. So what is your view on the impact of GST on states?
Well, let me put it this way, that we are studying the impact of GST on each state, because it impacts the revenue stream for the period for which we are going to make a projection. That's 20 to 25. Now, as regards the continuation of the GST scheme for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, and the compensation says to be continued, the Finance Minister of Odisha is a member of the GST Council. This is a decision entirely of the GST Council and not the Finance Commission. Thank you very much for this interaction. And finally, let me say that we have greatly benefited from our brief but exceedingly productive interactions with Odisha government and with all stakeholders in Odisha. Thank you.